Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Fletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you'd like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. I love talking to people who have a record of longevity in making the world a better place for other autistic people, and that's exactly what today's guest has done. Dr. Catriona Stewart joins me to discuss the intersection of women and the autistic experience, growing a nonprofit from an idea to a sustainable organization, and writing a brief on autism for Police Scotland. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Catriona, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for asking, Doug. Delighted to be here.
And I wanted to start off our conversation by learning, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
Well, that's a good question. Where to start? I actually started to research autism for my Master of Science degree, which was I started around 20 years ago, and I was actually doing a Master of Science degree in herbal medicine, believe it or not. And someone had asked me when I was an undergraduate, someone had asked me if I'd known anything about the herbal treatment of Crohn's disease in autistic children. And I'd said at the time, no, I don't know anything about that, but I'll see what I can find out. And I started to look into the whole thing. And I did, as often happens to people, I got completely drawn into the world of autism. I was so fascinated that I decided to do my Master of Science degree looking at issues around really around controversies of diagnosis, theories of etiology, the biomedical theories of autism. I mean, it was only a few years after Andrew Wakefield had published his explosive and very controversial piece in the Lancet, and everything that kind of followed from that. So that's really where it started. And then I was lecturing on a BSc course, a Bachelor of Science degree course at Edinburgh Napier University, and they funded me to do my PhD. Shall I give you the long title of my PhD thesis? Would you like that?
Sure. It's a podcast. We can spend as much time talking as we need to.
It's so hermeneutic phenomenology, the experiences of girls with Asperger's syndrome and anxiety undergoing a course of Western herbal medicine. That was my PhD. But of course, I actually just got more and more interested in the autism. And well, I wasn't interested in herbal medicine, but because I was the really one of the very, very first people to focus on girls and women. By the time I finished my PhD, I suddenly was an expert in the field, a very small field, if you like. So that's kind of where it started. And I should probably mention too, of course, that I was training for my PhD, because the PhD is a training ground for researchers as much as anything else. And I was doing some training around theory into practice with a joint course between the university and the National Autistic Society. And at some point during this assessed course that I was taking, I had that aha moment where it dawned on me that autism was something that was personal to me. It wasn't just an academic topic.
Now, you mentioned that you got your PhD regarding girls on the spectrum and Western herbal medicine. What were some of the things you learned in regards to herbal medicine on the impact of these autistic girls?
Well, it was a very small study and it was a qualitative study. So it was an experiential kind of, methodology, if you like. So I wasn't running a trial. I couldn't say herbs will do this or that. But what I would say is that the outcome for the girls taking the herbal medicine was really very similar to anyone else. If you can optimize someone's general health and well-being, you have a look at their diet, you maybe improve some of the common, coexisting things that a lot of autistic people experience. So things like insomnia, high levels of anxiety, IBS. Herbal medicine is a very gentle way of, can very gently tackle some of these things. They can help to relax people. They can help to kind of reduce inflammation in the digestive tract, generally help with sleep. So it's not that you can treat the autism because, as we know, it's not a disease or an illness. But what it can do is it can help to improve the general health of anyone, including autistic people.
Now, after you earned your PhD, you that was sort of the beginning in ways for you because you founded SWAN, which is the Scottish Women's Autism Network. That's an autistic-led charity delivering services, information, and support for and by autistic women and girls across Scotland since 2012. So, what do you think were some of the things SWAN did that you think were most helpful to autistic women?
Well, we launched in 2012, and there was absolutely nothing for autistic women and girls at that point, nothing. And it was myself and five other women, autistic women that were already kind of doing a bit of advocacy and representative work in Scotland. And we sat in a room at Strathclyde University, and we worked out what we were going to do to change the world. We very quickly drew up a set of aims and conditions of engagement, but fundamentally what we did was we increased our own visibility, and we talked to each other, and we learned about ourselves, and we learned about each other, and we shared our experiences, and we found some commonalities. We were all very different, and I wasn't actually diagnosed at that point. I had not been for an assessment, and I was kind of, I wasn't really focused on that at that point. But I was told by the autistic women in the group that they were taking me as one of them anyway, and that was that was fine. We just see you as one of us. So, okay, that's lovely, thank you. And so, we began to build a sense of who we began to retrieve a sense of self. I mean, for a lot of autistic people who've spent their formative years masking and trying to fit in, they kind of lose the sense of who they actually are. So primarily it was about visibility, and it was about shared understanding, and it was improving and increasing, adding to the knowledge base, if you like. Of course, we started disseminating that. We very quickly produced a couple of leaflets, which was guides to healthcare professionals when working with autistic women. That we produced that very quickly, and that was just from minutes from our meetings. That was just from us chatting. And then we did another one that was tips for autistic women as patients. We began to run learning events like conferences where we disseminated what we were learning. We shared that with professionals and parents and other autistic people, and built an online Facebook network. We've got a Facebook private network that's got about 800 women in it currently, a Facebook page. So we just shone a light on the fact that we exist, really.
I love what you said about changing the world. And I know for us, very much can relate to that. But I know for us as autistic people, change can be stressful, it can be overwhelming. So, how did you kind of go from not being overwhelmed, but also wanting to, definitely kind of move forward and change the world?
That's actually a very interesting question. I mean, I guess what I drew on, and this comes into how to make an organization like Swan work. I was drawing on a lot of things in my past. So I was very involved in student politics. I was very involved in the tail end of second wave feminism. So essentially, Swan was very much based on this idea of, we used to talk about consciousness raising groups. Well, consciousness raising groups are actually just people sitting talking to each other. And through that conversation, you begin to learn, and your consciousness becomes raised as you begin to understand that your individual lived experiences are situated in a wider societal context. So your personal life is your personal life, your experiences, your background, all the things that feed into who you are. But there are shared commonalities which are about our position in society. And so I guess I drew on that, the consciousness raising, the talking to people, the inclusivity of it, that you actually you accept people because you have a shared characteristic, and that's the important thing. Personal is political, which it certainly is. And I also trained, at one point, I did a course in youth and community work, which I'd never really used in terms of work, but I trained in, group work and facilitation. And so all of that fed into Swan. But in terms of change, I guess I honestly thought that Swan would be something I would do a couple of days a month for a couple of years, and then I would pass it on. I had no way of knowing it would end up being more than a full-time job. I was going to eat, sleep, breathe, you know, Swan, and I was going to do it for over 10 years. And all honesty, Doug, I'm actually very, very, very tired. And I am loving seeing the changes that are happening. I don't think they go far enough. I don't think they go deep enough. And we've got a long, long way to go. But I handed Swan over to a new CEO last year and a couple of other members of staff that we'd recruited. And I am so proud of it. In terms of change, it's odd to be stepping back and just watching it happen. But I tell you, I actually cry with pride. Sometimes I'm so happy. I'm so just excited at what they're doing. You know, it's Lindsay McAdam, Mandy Williams, and Becky Choate are the three autistic women leading Swan now, and they are doing fantastic work. But I'll not go on about that anymore. But yeah, change is difficult. It is. And we've all dealt with a lot of changes over the last few years. And we had COVID, and yeah, I'm tired. I'm really, really tired.
Well, I think it's really impressive what you've done because, over the years, I've seen lots of autistic people start out with nonprofits, charities, or social projects with amazing intentions to make the world better for other autistic people. However, it's so hard to maintain these organizations, and it leads to them folding or not having the impact that people set out to make. So, what were some of the things that you did at Swan to go from a small volunteer led organization? You said, initially maybe just doing it a couple of days a week or something, a couple hours a week, to now what it's known today as a groundbreaking autistic led charity?
It's a really good question. And I think there's a number of factors. I would say, first of all, I think it's really important to have a very clearly defined goal. What is it you're actually trying to do? And then have a very solid methodology. How are you going to do it? And as I sort of referred to earlier, I guess I have quite a strong philosophical outlook on things. I have training. I was also a member of the School of Philosophy in Scotland, which was really, really helped me, and it fed into the methodology I used for my PhD, which was very much about lived experience and shared understanding, shared perspectives. And so Swan was very much based on principles of inclusion and participation and equality. I mean, if you're building something like this, the means really does have to match what you're trying to achieve. So in other words, if you want respect and you want social inclusion and you want participation and you want equality, you kind of have to walk your talk. So you need to act out as you build your organization. And there have been so many people have been very enthusiastic about Swan and wanted to be involved, but either as members and active kind of advocates and participants, and also people who maybe are not autistic, who also are quite interested in the whole thing. And I was once accused of having something called founder syndrome, which is absolutely not the case. I tell you, I have spent 10 years trying to find a replacement, and then I found her. I found her in 2020. Recruited Lindsay. I was going, yes. So this is my heritage. This is my succession plan now. So, but it was very difficult to get a critical mass of individuals who had the skills, the capacity, and the understanding of what Swan was about in order to keep it alive. Always been dependent on individual autistic women who picked up the whatever you want to call it, the reins, the baton, or whatever, and ran the local meetup groups. Because Swan fundamentally, more than anything else, it's absolutely about women, groups of women meeting to talk and share their experiences. And we have groups now all over Scotland, and that's very dependent on voluntary support. And so there's been a small number of people. I would love to name check them all, but I'm always frightened I'll miss someone out. I mean, I had a fantastic woman who was my right-hand woman for 7 years, Lynn Moffat. And then Ronnie Casement came along and ran the Glasgow meetup group. And Emma Perry, there's been, and Sephora Johnson, who's just fantastic. I mean, there's been some amazing women who throughout the years have just been absolutely stalwart and kept the thing going, especially during COVID. So someone accused me of this founders syndrome, and I actually went, look, I'm going to push back on that. I don't have founders syndrome, but I do want to make sure that when Swan moves into other hands, they're hands who actually understand the founding principles of the organisation and understand about how they have to support and include other women. I better be careful not to rant here. There's a bit of a tendency for some of the self-directed autism advocates and representatives can be actually quite combative with other autistic people. They can be quite kind of no, I want to be the biggest voice in this small arena here, and they can get their elbows out. And they can actually be really quite aggressive to each other, and that really makes me very, very sad. It really makes me sad. I mean, we have enough problems in society as autistic people without doing that to each other. So I guess what I'm saying is it's always been really important to me that the people that kind of were involved with Swan really got it, really got what we're about. And that's why it's taken so long to grow, actually. It's taken really 10 years to grow, and it only really took off when my full-time job at Scottish Autism, they decided to second my post for 3 years to work for Swan full-time to get it onto a sustainable footing. And the first thing I did was I got funding from Scottish Government, and then COVID hit. And so that was an extraordinary time. But I think the critical point really came when I was working full-time for Swan, and that made a huge difference. One of the other things I was going to say about how to ensure the impact and sustainability is also build a network of allies. And I've had some fantastic autistic allies throughout the years. Sometimes that relationship can be pragmatic. So in other words, they're giving you support because they're getting something out of it. I'm a lot more cynical, I think, than I used to be. You know what we're like? We're very naive, aren't we? We go, oh, friends, how lovely. but also, because I'm quite an old person, I suppose to some extent I've also learned that actually it can be okay. It can be okay to understand that someone else has a different agenda, perhaps ultimately than you do, but you can maybe make your agendas merge for a while. And that's really important if you get offered that support. You just have to be careful that you don't end up getting exploited or taken over. And that's a constant tension too, I think. But I mean, I've had some fantastic support, fantastic allies of the Scottish Government, for example, and quite a number of individuals. Again, I'm a bit worried about name checking in case I miss people out, but people like Richard Mills, for example, of AT Autism, he put me in touch with people like Dr. Dinah Murray and Dr. Damien Milton. And so I got involved in a whole lot of things there, working with them on the National Autism Project, for example. And all of that raised my visibility and therefore the visibility of my organisation. And that was fantastic. I'm a bit concerned I'm whiffling now, so I'll kind of pause there.
No, absolutely. I had the pleasure to speak with Dinah on this podcast a couple of years ago. What was your? I was always so impressed by her. What was your experience with Dinah?
Dinah was actually a very, very good friend. We were very good friends for a while. I mean, I met her. So I was presenting on my PhD in 2014 there was this series of research seminars, Scottish Government funded research seminars in 2014, and they wanted to get a snapshot of all the autism research that was going on in Scotland that year. And I met Richard Mills, who said, oh, right, I need to introduce you to some people. And he invited me down to take part in a research project that he was involved with, which was about mentoring for autistic people. And the advisory team there, so Damien was actually working as a research assistant, and Dinah was part of the advisory team. And from that meeting, Dinah had been asked to be on a steering group for a 3-year highly funded project called the National Autism Project, which was funded by Dave Steve Shirley. And Dinah had said, well, I will do it, but I don't want to be the token autistic person. And also, every single other person involved in this project will have a team of people behind them. She said, I want a team of people behind me. So she invited a group of people to be her team, if you like. So Damien Milton, Yo Dunn, Wyn Lawson, Lenny Buckle, Larry Arnold, and myself. I think that was it. So we met a number of times, and I used to go and stay with Dinah quite often when I was down in London. And we worked together on that project very successfully, I would say. As a group, we did really, really well. We had a big impact. And then I just kept in touch. And sometimes, she was coming to Scotland, we would meet up for lunch or whichever. I interviewed Dinah for the Right Click programme that I had built for Scottish Autism between 2016 and 2018. And so she features in that resource. I interviewed a lot of autistic women and quite a lot of professionals, lots of people like Judith Gould and Tony Atwood and a lot of people, but certainly some fabulous autistic women, including Dinah and Sarah Hendricks and Carly Jones and Helen Ellis and Lynn Moffat and Debbie Brown and just, lots and lots of people. It was great. Mm-hmm. I got paid to talk to autistic people. How good was that?
That's the way it should be. Now, I always love to learn about other autistic people's experiences in other countries and cultures. And in recent years, you've done work with the Scottish Police Authority and wrote a briefing on autism for Police Scotland and ran a survey of autistic people's experiences. What were autistic people's experiences with the police there? And for those that may have had some negative experiences, are there things that could have been done to turn around some of those situations?
Yeah, I mean, I've done some training in the past as well with police, and it really is a case of, well, okay, let me go back to your question. So in between the National Autism Project and the start of COVID, I was an advisor to a 2-year project in Scotland, which was an independent review of the Mental Health Act in relation to autism and learning disability in Scotland. So, for the purposes of the mental health legislation, autism and learning disability are both defined as mental health disorders within the category of that legislation. So in other words, autistic people, learning disabled people can actually be incarcerated, if you like, against their will just for being autistic or learning disabled. Now, that's not necessarily going to happen a great deal, but it is a possibility. So I was an advisor to this 2-year project, and on the back of my work with that project, when COVID hit, the highly respected and very experienced human rights lawyer, John Scott, who was John Scott QC, is now John Scott Casey, is actually now Lord Scott. He was asked by the Chief Constable of Police Scotland in Livingston to set up an independent advisory group to the Scottish Police Authority in order to provide public accountability, scrutiny and assurance to the policing of the COVID response legislation, which had effectively stripped every one of their human rights. Within a space of about 3 days, basically the legislation was introduced. And as far as I know, I was recommended to John by the Mental Welfare Commission, Colin Mackay. Anyway, so it was through my work on the independent review. And so during COVID, twice a week, for 2 to 3 hours each session, we were meeting every week, twice a week. So meeting for about between 4 to 6 hours with senior members of Police Scotland and members of the Scottish Police Authority. And that's when I wrote my briefing for the police. And it was a kind of form of an open letter to the police. And that, as far as I know, went up on their intranet. And it's actually gone off into the world. I think it went to human rights group down in Westminster, as far as I know. And I think it's got, because they were quite impressed with it. But of course, I did my usual, and I went up on Facebook and I asked autistic people, what do you need me to tell them? What do they need to know? And then I wrote this 1-page briefing, which was, like I say, it's an open letter. And of course, any of us could be autistic. We could be anyone that you meet on a daily basis. And keep in mind that we have issues around communication and that kind of thing. I was so impressed with what I was hearing from Police Scotland, and their genuine imperative was to keep people safe. And they were very concerned about how they wanted to know more about what people were thinking and feeling. And so I have a friend who's got a social research company. She does a lot of work for the Scottish Government anyway. So she helped me put together an online survey, and she hosted it for me. And that's when I put out the survey asking what people's experiences of policing the COVID legislation was. And I also kind of snuck in a couple of questions about their experiences of human rights. And generally, and actually, one of the saddest, most poignant responses was when I asked a question about, do you feel that autistic people's, I can't remember what the question was. It was something like, do you feel like, autistic people's generally have their human rights met or whatever? And someone just went, no, lol. It's so sad. And then there was another woman who I just thought this was so telling. She said, please don't bang on about our special rights and make everyone hate us. And I thought that is such an indictment on society that a grown autistic woman can feel that by wanting to access her human rights, she's asking for special favors and people are going to hate her for it. That to me is a real indictment. So yeah, I mean, I think in general, to be honest, there weren't that many reports of poor interactions with the police, and where there were a couple of people actually said that their interactions have been really good, which was really nice to hear, and a couple who did say actually their experiences weren't very good, they made a point of saying, but they weren't. What do you expect? The police represent the rest of society, and the rest of society is fairly ignorant when it comes to interacting with autistic people. So why would you expect anything different from the police? I have a slightly different take on that, actually. I'm afraid I kind of feel like we need our police to be exemplars rather than just reflective of the rest of society. But I have to say, I think the thing is, a lot of autistic people would probably avoid coming into contact with the police if they could possibly avoid it. And that's another question altogether. Who calls on the police when they need help, and where they don't, why are they not doing so? I have to say that I have been treated with enormous amounts of respect. So at the end of that year, the end of a year on the Independent Advisory Group, I was given an opportunity to apply to be a member of the board. And so I applied, and so I am now a member of the Scottish Police Authority, and I've just moved into my third year. Actually, it's extraordinary, I can't believe it. And I'm very much there in my own right, and not just because of the talk about autism, but obviously I use that opportunity every chance I get to raise awareness in terms of issues around equality and diversity. And I try my best to just to kind of educate again. And I've been treated with enormous amounts of respect and support, while I'm there. And actually, I mean, I was blown away by the Scottish Police Authority Corporate Services, because the first thing they did was say, how can we help you? What can we do? Is there anything you need from us? And offering accommodations, offering support. And I delivered training on autism in the workplace to 40 members of the corporate services team just before Christmas. Not waving a wand, and haven't actually changed the world yet, but little by little, I think there is impact. I think the awareness is being raised. And I guess, go back to your question, I mean, some of the work has involved things like, doing a tour of a couple of the custody suites. And one of the custody suites we went to it'd been done up it was before COP26, and it specifically kind of renovated it in relation to if they had to taking in children, which of course no one wants to do, but it does happen. And I found that really interesting on two counts. One was the police at this particular custody suite was talking about a young girl, a teenage girl, child, effectively, who they'd had to bring in 2 or 3 times for her protection and for her family's protection. And I immediately went, see, my antenna had gone out. Is that girl autistic? And as soon as I mentioned that, we get into some great conversations about neurodiversity and what that means. And then the next part of the conversation we all agreed was that the renovations to that custody suite were specifically to make it easier for children to be there. They weren't resource heavy. It wasn't expensive, but actually the result would make it better for everybody. So autistic people, children, maybe other vulnerable adults, people that work there. So we've had some really interesting conversations around things like that. And I do raise the issue whenever possible that autistic people, neurodiverse people, neurominorities, I like to call them, so that means ADHD as well, are disproportionately represented within the criminal justice system. We have a huge thing in Scotland about mental health and well-being, both in terms of society and in terms of police officers themselves. But certainly there's a huge, it's such a big part of what the police do is deal with people with mental health issues, and they know that a lot of the people who they come into contact with have got mental health problems. And I've also raised that, but again, autistic people tend to have higher level than other people with mental health issues. So there's a huge overlap there. And I do, as you can gather from the amount I'm talking now, I do use every opportunity to raise these things.
And how can our listeners learn about you beyond this interview?
I'm quite out there on, if you Google, so there's two Catriona Stewarts in Scotland. Well, there's maybe a few of us, but there's two who come up on Google. One is a journalist who's very blonde and pretty, and so obviously not me. If you kind of do Dr. Catriona Stewart, OBE, that'll take you to the right person. I've got a number of things up there online. I'm building a new website that will be launched at some point fairly soon, I hope. I've written a chapter and a bit in a book called Spectrum Women, Walking to the Beat of Autism. If you can Google, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. And like I said, there's a couple of recordings of interviews with me on Google. I did one for the National Autistic Society on the peer mentoring project that I ran. Scottish Government funded a one-year pilot peer mentoring project. That was brilliant, actually. I'd love to get more money to do more of that, particularly with young people. Changing the world, we need to get into the schools. We really need to support those young people getting through their adolescence and into adulthood with their mental health and self-esteem intact. That will change the world if we can do that. All I can think of, actually, at the moment.
Now, it's pretty obvious you've been doing some great work in supporting other autistic people for well over a decade now, particularly with your support for women and girls. So I'm wondering, what is next for you, or what would you like to see other advocates do in supporting autistic women and girls now and into the future?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a very big question. I personally will be continuing on the board of the Scottish Police Authority for at least the next year and possibly the next couple of years. And that to me is a really important job. I mean, it's quite demanding, it's quite stressful, but I feel it's really important to hang on in there and contribute what I can, because I'm also so I've gone back to my one-to-one clinical work, and I'm also running diagnostic assessments for a small organisation based in England called Axia. I do most of these diagnostic assessments online, and it's fantastic because I get a chance to bring all my knowledge and experience to the individual who's there in this really important time in their life. And I try to make it as positive and as affirmative as it could possibly be. And I like to look at it as a transitional time for them, where hopefully that diagnostic assessment will be a springboard for them to do things in their life that are positive and to build tools for self-care and self-advocacy and all those things. But it was odd because actually I love it, and it's a privilege and a joy to be there. But actually doing that one-to-one work again has made me realise just how important the high-level strategic change society work really is, because so many people come to those assessments really have had such a terrible time one way or the other. I just think autistic people need to work together, and we need to really accept that we all bring different things to the table, that focusing on one particular group of autistic people doesn't mean that you're denying everyone else. So if you look at the disability rights movement in the 1960s, it wasn't until the disability rights groups started to really draw together and work together that real social change happened. That's one thing I would like to see. I would like to see autistic people working better together. I know we're a bit like the Celts, generally very bright, very able, very creative, great horse people, but terrible in a team. I think we need to learn a bit more teamwork. In terms of specifics to do with, I'm actually, the more I do this work, the more I realize a lot of boys and men do, all those characteristics that we talk about, the masking and the fitting in and the, all that stuff. So these are shared learnings, if you like. These are things we've learned. The gender identity issues, the difficulty we have. I don't think I've ever talked to an autistic woman, and I've talked to hundreds of autistic women, where we haven't, all of us at some point, questioned our gender identity, because mostly we don't get it. We don't get, what does this mean, this thing that's supposed to be male and female, and how are we supposed to perform that? So a lot of autistic girls, and I suspect men too, they're either really, really girly or they're really rebel against it. No, I don't mean really, really girly. I mean, they perform it really well. I mean, a lot of it is a performance, really. I mean, I actually think I almost think picking a gender identity is another form of masking. You know, in my day, because I'm an old person, and in my day, there were very few choices. So you were either female or trans. There wasn't really anything else. And I picked being a feminist female because I thought, oh, I can do feminist. It's another performance, isn't it? It's another kind of like, I'll adopt that persona and I'll do the best I can with that. I would really like to see a complete rewriting of the narrative around autism, because girls are still getting told their lives are going to be over, that they're not going to be able to have babies or work with children, or there's no evidence for any of that nonsense at all. And I'd say about half the women in Swan certainly are raising families or have raised families. I've got 2 adult daughters I'm incredibly proud of. They're fabulous, good people. God, if I can do it, anyone. Anyone can. Sorry, it's a silly thing to say, but I would really like that to change, because I want to go back to getting girls into adulthood and young men into adulthood who feel okay about themselves and are reaching their potential and are not hiding in their rooms because they're frightened to go out. I would like to see much better levels of training in all the services across all the sectors, so that it is so much easier for people to be employed without the damage that being employed quite often does to us in terms of our mental health and well-being. I would like to see specific services better informed and better trained. So, for example, antenatal classes, health visitors, maternity suites. You know, now I'm not saying having babies is what defines women, because of course it doesn't, but it is an important part of a lot of women's lives, and there's nothing there at the moment that's specifically informed for autistic people, and so much research needing done. People are finally beginning to pick up on the fact that autistic people get old. You know, they might go through the menopause, they might end up in care homes. Oh, goodness forbid, I don't want that to happen, but it might. Sorry, Doug, you asked a big question. You asked a big question. There's a lot has changed in the last 10 years, but we have a long way to go still.
Well, it might have been a big question, but like with all these questions, you gave big, great, wonderful answers. So thanks so much, Catriona. Thanks so much, Dr. Stewart, for joining me today. It was a pleasure getting to know you a little bit.
Oh, thanks, Doug. Thank you very much. And like I say, it's been my pleasure. And thank you very much for asking me.
Thanks so much to Dr. Stewart for the conversation. To learn more about Dr. Stewart, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. At Autism Personal Coach, we provide customized coaching for autistics to help improve the quality of our lives. All of our coaches are either autistic or autistic selected for their commitment to trauma informed and neurodiversity affirming strategies. They deeply understand burnout, sensory needs, executive functioning, and the importance of special interests. If you're interested in learning more about our coaching, please visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, it would be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.